Eleanor tightened her grip on the boarding pass as she stood in the bustling airport terminal. Her heart racing with a mix of excitement and nerves. Today was the day her first solo flight. She felt a surge of independence, knowing she would be flying across the country all on her own to visit her aunt. It was the beginning of an adventure she had imagined for weeks. She had spent the entire morning preparing, wanting everything to be just right. After much thought, she picked her favorite outfit, a bright yellow crop top with delicate lace sleeves, paired with high-waisted denim shorts. The outfit made her feel confident, vibrant, and grown up. Her white sneakers, perfectly clean and comfortable, were ideal for traveling, and she had even curled her hair, which now bounced softly around her shoulders with every step. Eleanor smiled to herself, glancing down at the little silver necklace with a heart pendant, a gift from her mom. It was a small, simple charm, but wearing it made her feel closer to home. She glanced over her shoulder to check her backpack. Her trusted pink bag decorated with colorful patches, a small sunflower, a rainbow, and a bright pink heart. Each patch was a piece of her personality, bright, full of life, and a little bit quirky. Holding the ticket tight in one hand, she adjusted the backpack on her shoulders and took a deep breath. She felt ready, more ready than ever, for the freedom and excitement waiting just beyond the boarding gate. Eleanor's eyes sparkled as she approached the gate. She flashed a polite smile at the flight attendant, a woman with perfectly styled hair and a crisp uniform. "Hi," Eleanor said cheerfully, handing over her ticket. The attendant, whose name tag read Amelia, barely looked at Eleanor, glancing instead at her ticket and then back at Eleanor's outfit with a narrowed, scrutinizing gaze. There was something cold, almost unwelcoming, in her stare, and Eleanor felt a pang of discomfort. Maybe she's just had a long day, Eleanor thought, trying to brush off the strange feeling. She didn't want to let anything dampen her excitement. As she walked down the aisle, Eleanor's confidence returned. She had managed to score a window seat, her favorite spot. There was something magical about watching the clouds drift by and the earth slowly shrinking below. She stowed her pink backpack in the overhead compartment, slid into her seat, and looked out the window, feeling the thrill of what was to come. She reached into her bag for her headphones, already picturing herself zoning out to her favorite music as the plane took off. But then, just as Eleanor was about to put on her headphones, she noticed Amelia making her way down the aisle. There was a determined look in her eyes, and Eleanor's stomach dropped. Before she knew it, Amelia was standing directly in front of her, arms crossed tightly. "Excuse me, young lady," Amelia said loudly, her voice sharp enough to turn a few heads. "You're in the wrong seat." Eleanor blinked, momentarily thrown off. She glanced at her boarding pass, then at the seat number above her head. No, this is my seat," she replied, holding up her ticket. 18A. See? Amelia barely glanced at the ticket, her gaze still cold and unrelenting. "That's not the issue here," she snapped, her voice dripping with disdain. "You're dressed inappropriately for this flight." Eleanor felt her cheeks flush. She looked down at her outfit, suddenly doubting herself. What could possibly be wrong with her clothes? She'd chosen them carefully, making sure they were both comfortable and neat. She swallowed, feeling a strange mix of confusion and hurt. I don't understand," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "My clothes are fine." "Oh, really?" Amelia let out a short, mean laugh. "You think it's acceptable to wear a shirt that shows your stomach and shorts that barely cover your legs? This is not the beach, young lady." Eleanor felt every eye on her, whispering voices reaching her ears as she tried to shrink back into her seat. She had never felt this embarrassed, this exposed, in her life. It was as though every ounce of excitement and joy she had felt earlier was being snatched away, leaving her cold and humiliated. "But this is my seat," she whispered, her voice trembling as she tried to hold back tears. "I have a ticket. I'm not doing anything wrong." Amelia leaned closer, her tone icy. "I'm telling you, you're not allowed to stay here. Either you move to another seat, or you leave this plane altogether. Do you understand?" Eleanor's hands shook as she reached up to the overhead compartment, blindly grabbing her backpack, her vision blurred with tears as she glanced around. hoping someone would say anything to help her, to stand up for her. But the other passengers merely looked away, avoiding her gaze. She felt so small, so utterly alone. As she walked down the aisle, past rows of silent faces, Amelia's final words echoed behind her. Cruel and cutting. Maybe next time, you'll think twice about how you dress and where you sit. Eleanor stepped off the plane, standing alone at the gate, watching as the engines roared to life. Her plane was leaving without her, carrying away not just her excitement but her sense of self, leaving her feeling empty and humiliated. She sat on a nearby bench, clutching her pink backpack tightly, her cheeks wet with silent tears. The happiness she had felt just minutes ago had vanished, replaced by a heavy weight she didn't know how to carry. Eleanor sat alone on the cold airport bench, her knees pulled up close, her face buried in her hands. She could still feel the sting of Amelia's cruel words and the weight of all those strangers' stares. The airport was bustling with people moving around her, yet she felt entirely invisible, lost in her own world of confusion and shame. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, snapping her back to reality. She wiped her face with the sleeve of her yellow top and pulled out her phone. Her mom's name lit up on the screen. She hesitated, dreading how her voice might shake if she tried to speak. But she knew she couldn't leave her mom in the dark. Taking a deep breath, Eleanor pressed answer. Hi, Mom, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Eleanor, honey, are you on the plane? Did you find your seat okay? Her mother's cheerful voice instantly made Eleanor's throat tighten with emotion. But the warm familiarity broke through her walls. And before she could stop herself, her voice cracked, releasing a flood of tears she'd been holding back. Mom, she managed to choke out, unable to say much else through the sobs. Honey, what happened? Her mother's voice turned serious, with a hint of worry that made Eleanor's heart ache even more. Between shallow breaths, Eleanor struggled to explain, her words tangled up in anger, sadness, and embarrassment. The flight attendant, she said. My clothes, and my seat, she stammered, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Wait. Slow down, sweetheart, her mom said gently, but Eleanor could hear the tension building in her mother's voice. What did the flight attendant say about your clothes? She said I looked wrong. Eleanor said, her words wavering, that I was in the wrong seat and dressed inappropriately. But I wasn't, Mom, I swear, I wasn't. I had my ticket, and my clothes are fine, but she made me leave the plane. Everyone was staring, and no one said anything to help. There was a brief, loaded silence on the other end, and Eleanor could almost feel her mom's protective anger rising like a wave. When her mom finally spoke, her voice was low and steady, filled with a fierce determination that Eleanor found both comforting and powerful. Eleanor, listen to me, her mom said. You did absolutely nothing wrong. I am so proud of you for standing up for yourself. Even if that flight attendant couldn't see how incredible you are, you deserve to be treated with respect. And I'm not going to let this slide. I'm calling the airline right now. And I'm going to make sure they understand exactly what happened. But, Mom, the plane already left. I'm just sitting here at the gate. I don't know what to do. Eleanor said, her voice small and defeated. Stay right there, her mom replied, her tone firm and unbreakable. You are not alone in this. I'll call you back as soon as I've spoken to someone at the airline. Just sit tight, okay? Eleanor nodded, even though her mom couldn't see her. Okay, Mom, she whispered, her heart swelling with a glimmer of hope. As she hung up, Eleanor noticed an elderly woman sitting a few seats away, watching her with gentle, sympathetic eyes. The woman had soft, silver hair tucked neatly under a hat and was wearing a cozy cardigan that looked handmade. She had a small suitcase by her side and held a book in her lap. Though it seemed she hadn't been reading for a while. The woman leaned over, her voice soft and kind. Excuse me, dear, are you all right? She asked, her eyes warm with concern. Eleanor hesitated for a moment, but something about the woman's gentle presence made her feel safe enough to speak. She nodded, though her voice was unsteady. I was supposed to be on that plane. But, the flight attendant made me leave. She said I wasn't dressed properly and that I didn't belong in my seat. The woman's expression softened, and she reached out, giving Eleanor's hand a reassuring pat. I saw what happened, and I want you to know that none of it was your fault. That flight attendant was completely out of line. Sometimes, people make others feel small just to make themselves feel powerful. But that doesn't mean they're right. The kindness in the woman's words made Eleanor's eyes well up with fresh tears. But this time, they were mixed with relief. Thank you, she whispered, her voice barely a breath. I didn't know what to do, everyone just stared. And no one said anything. I felt so alone. Well, you're not alone now, the woman replied with a reassuring smile. My name's Mrs. Thompson, and I'm glad to meet you. Eleanor. Thank you, Mrs. Thompson, Eleanor said, managing a small, grateful smile. For the first time since being forced off the plane, she felt like she could breathe again. Mrs. Thompson looked thoughtful, her gaze shifting back toward the gate. You know, Eleanor, I happen to know a few people at this airline. Maybe we can talk to someone together. Someone who might be able to help make things right. Eleanor felt a tiny spark of hope flicker to life inside her chest. She wasn't sure if Mrs. Thompson's idea would actually work. But for the first time, she didn't feel entirely helpless. Do you really think they'd listen? Eleanor asked, her eyes wide with a mixture of doubt and hope. Mrs. Thompson gave her a warm smile, her eyes twinkling with determination. Yes, I do, but we'll need to be brave. Okay? And your mom will be here soon, too, so we'll all stand together. You're not alone. Eleanor, not anymore. For the first time since her ordeal began, Eleanor felt like she had allies. She clutched her backpack a little tighter. And though her heart was still heavy, the sadness didn't feel as overwhelming. She glanced at Mrs. Thompson, who gave her a reassuring nod, as if to say, we've got this. As they sat together, waiting for her mother's call, Eleanor began to feel a flicker of strength stirring within her. She wasn't sure what would happen next. But with her mom and Mrs. Thompson by her side, she dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, things would be okay. The next morning, Eleanor sat by her bedroom window, watching the sun break through the clouds. She had barely slept, her mind replaying the scene over and over. The memory of Amelia's harsh words and the silent stares of the other passengers had clung to her, filling her dreams with uneasy shadows. But today was a new day, and her mom had promised her they would be heading back to the airport. Though she didn't know what to expect, a part of her hoped for some closure. A chance to understand why things had happened the way they did. Her phone buzzed with a message from her mom downstairs. Be ready in 15, sweetheart. Today, we're not backing down. Eleanor took a deep breath, feeling the gentle encouragement in her mom's words. She chose an outfit carefully, a soft white blouse with small blue flowers and a pair of dark jeans, something that felt both comfortable and presentable. She slipped on her favorite white sneakers and pulled her hair into a neat ponytail. Glancing in the mirror one last time before heading downstairs. When they arrived at the airport, Eleanor's stomach twisted with nerves. She recognized the gate where everything had gone wrong yesterday, and she felt a fresh wave of apprehension. But today, her mom held her hand firmly, and Eleanor drew strength from her mother's presence. As they walked toward the check-in area, Eleanor spotted a familiar face waiting by the counter, Mrs. Thompson. The kind older woman from yesterday. Hello, Eleanor. Mrs. Thompson greeted her warmly, her eyes crinkling in a reassuring smile as she pulled her in for a quick hug. I'm so glad you made it. I've been thinking about what happened and how unfairly you were treated. Today, we're going to do something about it. Eleanor's mom exchanged a grateful nod with Mrs. Thompson. Thank you for being here. I was livid when I heard what happened. No one should have to go through that. Especially not my daughter. Mrs. Thompson's smile softened, and she turned to Eleanor with a mysterious gleam in her eyes. There's something I didn't mention yesterday, Eleanor, because I wanted to see how the staff would treat you without any special treatment. But now, I think it's time you knew the truth. Eleanor looked up at her, intrigued. What do you mean? Mrs. Thompson took a breath and gave Eleanor's shoulder a gentle squeeze. I work for this airline. In fact, I'm the head of customer relations. I'm responsible for making sure that all of our passengers feel respected and valued. She paused, watching as Eleanor's eyes widened in surprise. When I saw what happened yesterday, I knew that Amelia's behavior was unacceptable, and I want to make sure it never happens again. Eleanor was stunned. The kind stranger who had comforted her at the gate was actually someone with power within the very company that had let her down. She felt a spark of excitement mixed with nerves. Maybe today things really would change. You work for the airline? Eleanor asked, barely able to believe it. But why didn't you say anything yesterday? Mrs. Thompson gave her a soft smile. Sometimes, it's best to observe people without them knowing who you are. It reveals their true character. And now, I have a plan. We're going to board another flight. And Amelia will be working again. This time, I want to see how she treats you without any knowledge of who I am. If she crosses a line, I'll be there to step in. Eleanor swallowed, feeling a knot of anxiety forming in her stomach. The thought of facing Amelia again made her heart race. But there was a sense of relief in knowing that Mrs. Thompson would be right there beside her. What do you need me to do? She asked, her voice trembling but steady. Just be yourself, Eleanor, Mrs. Thompson said reassuringly. Stand up for yourself if you need to. And remember that you have every right to be here. And if anything happens, I'll take it from there. Eleanor nodded, feeling a small surge of courage rise within her. With her mom's hand on her shoulder and Mrs. Thompson's encouraging smile, she walked toward the gate. Together, they checked in and made their way to the boarding area, waiting for their group to be called. Eleanor took slow, deep breaths, trying to stay calm. When they finally boarded the plane, Eleanor's nerves spiked as she spotted Amelia standing at the entrance, greeting passengers with her usual forced smile. The moment Amelia saw Eleanor, her expression flickered with surprise before she masked it with an overly sweet smile that felt as fake as her greeting. Welcome aboard, Amelia said, her voice dripping with forced politeness. I see you're back. I hope there won't be any misunderstandings this time. Eleanor's heart thudded, but she held her ground, remembering Mrs. Thompson's words. There weren't any misunderstandings yesterday either. Eleanor replied firmly. You just didn't treat me fairly. Amelia's smile faltered slightly, and a shadow of irritation crossed her face before she plastered the smile back on. Well then, let's make sure everything goes smoothly today. Shall we? She replied, her voice tinged with condescension. Eleanor walked down the aisle, finding her seat with her heart still pounding. She was relieved to see Mrs. Thompson settle into a seat nearby. Pretending to be just another passenger, her mother sat beside her, giving her hand a comforting squeeze. Eleanor took a deep breath, feeling grateful for the strength surrounding her. For the first hour, the flight was uneventful. Eleanor kept her gaze fixed on the window, trying to distract herself with the clouds below. But then she noticed Amelia making her way down the aisle with the drink cart, her eyes narrowing as she reached Eleanor's row. When Amelia stopped beside her, she leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper but sharp as a knife. Just make sure you behave this time. All right? Eleanor felt a cold shiver run down her spine. She clenched her fists, willing herself not to react. But before she could say anything, Mrs. Thompson rose from her seat, her expression calm but her gaze steely. Excuse me, Amelia, Mrs. Thompson said, her voice cool and firm. I think it's time you and I had a conversation. Amelia's eyes widened in shock, and her face turned a shade paler as she took a step back, realizing she was in trouble. I'm just doing my job, she stammered, trying to compose herself. Mrs. Thompson crossed her arms, her gaze unwavering. Are you? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're going out of your way to make this young girl feel uncomfortable and unwelcome. And that's not the kind of behavior we allow at this airline. She paused, letting her words sink in. My name is Mrs. Thompson, and I oversee customer relations for this airline. I'm here to make sure what happened yesterday is addressed and to see how you'd handle the situation today. Amelia's face turned ashen as she tried to stammer out an explanation. But Mrs. Thompson raised her hand, silencing her. Eleanor deserves respect, just like every other passenger on this plane. What you did yesterday was wrong, and it won't be ignored. There will be consequences for your actions. Eleanor watched as Mrs. Thompson's words sent a ripple of whispers through the nearby passengers. She felt a mixture of relief, gratitude, and pride. This time, justice was on her side. As Amelia stood there, too shocked to respond, Eleanor finally felt a weight lift off her chest. She hadn't been wrong to feel mistreated. And she wasn't alone in this. Mrs. Thompson and her mom were standing with her. And even the nearby passengers seemed to nod in silent agreement. For the first time since the humiliating ordeal had started, Eleanor felt strong. This time, she knew she wouldn't be silenced. Eleanor's heartbeat thundered in her chest as she settled into her seat. The confrontation had left her both shaken and strangely relieved. Seeing Amelia's shocked reaction when Mrs. Thompson revealed her authority had given her a sense of justice she hadn't expected. Today felt like a new beginning, one where she could finally stand up for herself. With people by her side who genuinely cared. The plane hummed with quiet murmurs as passengers stole glances at Eleanor and Mrs. Thompson. Some offered her sympathetic nods. Others seemed genuinely intrigued by the unfolding drama. Eleanor felt a warmth in her chest, no longer the sting of humiliation, but a cautious sense of pride. She wasn't just an anonymous face in the crowd anymore. People were seeing her, and this time, they were on her side. Just as Eleanor began to relax, Amelia emerged again, pushing the drink cart down the aisle. Her face was stiff, her hands white-knuckled on the cart handle as she moved from one row to the next, distributing drinks with a forced smile. The tension in her expression made it clear she knew she was being watched. And that knowledge seemed to weigh on her like a heavy burden. When Amelia reached Eleanor's row, her smile strained as she forced herself to maintain a polite tone. "Can I get you something to drink?" she asked, her voice barely masking a hint of frustration. Eleanor met her gaze evenly, surprised by her own steadiness. "Yes, please. Water would be fine." As Amelia handed her the cup of water, their eyes met briefly. There was a flash of something in Amelia's gaze, annoyance. Maybe resentment, but also a trace of nervousness. For the first time, Eleanor sensed that Amelia was beginning to understand the weight of her actions. This wasn't just another passenger she could brush off or bully into silence. Eleanor had allies now, and Amelia knew it. Mrs. Thompson watched the exchange from a few rows back, her expression thoughtful. She had taken notes on everything, her gaze quietly observing Amelia's every move. It was clear that Mrs. Thompson wasn't just here to make things right for Eleanor, she was here to set a precedent, to ensure no other passenger would endure the same treatment. As Amelia moved down the aisle, Eleanor caught a glimpse of Mrs. Thompson giving her a subtle nod. A silent message of reassurance that made Eleanor feel safe and supported. She took a sip of her water, her mind racing with a newfound determination. It wasn't just about herself anymore, this was about speaking up so that people in her position would be treated with dignity and respect in the future. Halfway through the flight, Amelia made another round with the snack cart. This time, she avoided Eleanor's gaze, her posture tense as if the weight of her previous actions pressed down on her. Eleanor sensed a shift, a subtle, hesitant change in Amelia's attitude. The harshness and condescension were gone, replaced by a restrained quiet that hinted at awareness, perhaps even regret. But it wasn't over yet. Just as Amelia reached Eleanor's row again, Mrs. Thompson rose from her seat and approached her calmly but firmly. "Amelia," she said, her voice soft but with an edge that commanded attention, "I'd like to have a word with you in the galley. Please." Amelia paled, casting a wary glance around as if seeking support. But the passengers around her avoided her gaze, their expressions unreadable. She followed Mrs. Thompson to the galley, her steps slow and reluctant. Eleanor watched them disappear down the aisle, her curiosity and nerves swirling together. She tried to catch snippets of their conversation, but all she could see was Mrs. Thompson's composed expression and Amelia's downcast eyes as they spoke in hushed tones. Although she couldn't hear the words, Eleanor could sense the importance of the conversation happening just out of her view. Minutes ticked by, and soon Mrs. Thompson re-emerged, her face calm and composed as ever. She offered Eleanor a reassuring smile, and Eleanor felt a flicker of relief. Amelia, however, did not return right away, and Eleanor wondered what might be going on behind the scenes. As Mrs. Thompson resumed her seat, the quiet murmur of conversation among passengers grew, and Eleanor couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions: pride, relief, and a trace of lingering unease. Whatever happened next, she knew she wasn't the same girl who had boarded this plane full of excitement only to be torn down. She was stronger now, not just because of herself, but because of the people who had shown her kindness and support. Just then, Amelia returned, her expression noticeably subdued, almost apologetic. She walked with her shoulders hunched, avoiding eye contact with Eleanor as she resumed her duties. It was as if some unspoken understanding had settled between them, a realization that respect was no longer an option, but a requirement. As the plane began its descent, Eleanor felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. She had stood up, found allies, and faced down her fears. And most importantly, she knew now that her voice had the power to change things, even in the smallest of ways. When the plane finally touched down, Mrs. Thompson leaned over to Eleanor, her voice warm and full of pride. "You did wonderfully, Eleanor. Never underestimate the strength you have. You have a voice, and it deserves to be heard." Eleanor nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude. As they walked off the plane together, side by side, Eleanor knew this experience had marked the beginning of something powerful, a newfound courage, an unshakable belief in her own worth, and a future where she would never let anyone make her feel small again. As Eleanor stepped off the plane, a mix of relief and pride settled over her. She glanced at Mrs. Thompson, who gave her a comforting nod. The support she'd received on this journey from her mother, Mrs. Thompson, and even the passengers had transformed her. This wasn't just a humiliating ordeal anymore. It was a moment that had changed her view of herself and her strength. But as they made their way into the terminal, Eleanor noticed Mrs. Thompson glancing toward the airline's customer service desk. There, Amelia was standing, her uniform as polished as ever, though her shoulders were slightly slouched. Her face looked drawn and weary, as if the weight of her actions was finally beginning to settle on her. Mrs. Thompson's lips tightened as she saw her, and she motioned for Eleanor and her mother to follow her. They approached the desk where Amelia was quietly talking to another attendant. Mrs. Thompson's calm but commanding presence seemed to ripple through the small crowd of onlookers, who shifted their attention to her with curious glances. "Amelia," Mrs. Thompson said, her voice firm but measured, "I think it's time we have a candid conversation about yesterday's events. And I'd like Eleanor to be here for it." Amelia's face turned a shade paler, her gaze darting nervously between Eleanor and Mrs. Thompson. The casual superiority she had displayed on the plane was gone, replaced with a deep discomfort that seemed to leave her at a loss for words. I didn't mean to cause any harm," Amelia stammered, her voice barely audible. "I was just doing my job." Mrs. Thompson raised a hand, cutting her off gently but firmly. "Doing your job doesn't give you the right to treat anyone disrespectfully, let alone a young girl who was simply here to enjoy her first solo trip," she said, her eyes never leaving Amelia's. "Yesterday, you humiliated Eleanor, you dismissed her, you questioned her, and you forced her off the plane for no reason other than your own biases." The quiet murmur of those around them grew louder, some passengers casting Amelia glances filled with disapproval. Eleanor felt her mother's hand rest gently on her shoulder, grounding her as she listened to Mrs. Thompson's calm but scathing words. Amelia's expression shifted, a flicker of shame crossing her face as she swallowed. I thought I was enforcing the airline's policies," she said, though her words sounded hollow. Mrs. Thompson's eyes narrowed. "The airline's policies are meant to ensure the safety and comfort of all passengers. Nowhere do they allow for targeting someone because of their clothing or the way they look." Eleanor followed every rule. She had her ticket. She was polite, and she was seated where she belonged. Eleanor felt her cheeks flush. But this time, it wasn't from embarrassment. It was from the strange warmth of being defended, of having her worth recognized so openly. She had never imagined someone would stand up for her like this, especially not in front of so many people. Amelia fidgeted, casting another anxious glance around, realizing the eyes of everyone at the counter were fixed on her. I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I didn't think." "That's the problem," Mrs. Thompson replied, her voice softening just slightly. "You didn't think. You didn't see Eleanor for who she was, a young girl eager for her first adventure. Instead, you saw whatever it was you assumed. And you acted on it. And that isn't just a mistake. Amelia, that's prejudice. Amelia looked down, her shoulders drooping as the weight of Mrs. Thompson's words settled over her. The silence that followed was heavy. And for the first time, Eleanor saw genuine remorse in Amelia's face. Mrs. Thompson turned to Eleanor, a warm smile breaking through her stern demeanor. Eleanor, you've shown incredible strength and courage. It's not easy to stand up for yourself, especially against someone who holds power over you. You should be proud of yourself. Eleanor managed a small nod, her heart pounding with a strange mix of emotions: relief, pride, and something close to forgiveness. Turning back to Amelia, Mrs. Thompson spoke again, her tone more formal. Amelia, I'll be forwarding a report on this incident to our upper management. Until they make a decision, you are suspended from your duties. Effective immediately. The color drained from Amelia's face as she realized the consequences of her actions. She opened her mouth to protest. But one look at Mrs. Thompson's unwavering gaze made her stop. She simply nodded, her eyes cast downward as she turned and walked away, vanishing into the sea of travelers. Once she was gone, Mrs. Thompson exhaled softly, as if letting go of the tension she'd been holding throughout the encounter. She turned back to Eleanor and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. This airline owes you an apology, Eleanor, she said, and I owe you my gratitude for being brave enough to come back today. Because of you, things will change, and you've reminded all of us that every passenger deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. Eleanor's heart swelled with gratitude, her voice barely above a whisper as she said, "Thank you, Mrs. Thompson, for everything." Mrs. Thompson smiled, a warm, genuine smile that reached her eyes. "It was my honor, Eleanor." As they walked away from the customer service desk, Eleanor felt lighter than she had in days. Her mother wrapped an arm around her, squeezing her shoulder gently. "I'm so proud of you, sweetheart," her mom murmured. "You didn't just stand up for yourself. You made a difference." They made their way through the terminal. And for the first time, Eleanor truly felt that she was stepping forward, leaving behind the weight of yesterday's hurt and embracing a newfound strength. It wasn't just about a flight or a seat on a plane anymore, it was about standing up, knowing her worth, and having the courage to ensure that others would be treated fairly too. As they exited the airport, Eleanor looked back one last time, a sense of peace settling over her. She knew this experience would stay with her, shaping the way she moved through the world. She had found her voice. And now, nothing and no one could ever make her feel small again. As Eleanor and her mother exited the airport, Mrs. Thompson caught up with them, her face glowing with warmth and pride. "Eleanor, before you go, there's one more thing I'd like to do to make things right," she said, her voice brimming with kindness. Eleanor looked up, surprised but curious. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Thompson smiled, gesturing toward the airline's first-class lounge. "I'd like to offer you and your mom a place in first class on our next flight as a gesture of our apology and to show you the respect you deserved all along. If you're ready, we'll rebook you right now and get you started on this trip the way it should have been." Eleanor's eyes widened in surprise, and she glanced at her mother, who gave her a nod of encouragement. "Really?" she asked, barely able to contain her excitement. For the first time, the pain from yesterday felt like it was melting away, replaced by a sense of pride and validation. Mrs. Thompson nodded. "Absolutely. And not only that," she added with a twinkle in her eye, "we want to offer you a special pass for future flights. I want you to feel at home whenever you fly with us and know that you're valued as a part of our family." Eleanor felt a flood of emotions: gratitude, relief, and a flicker of hope that perhaps the world could be fairer than she'd thought. Her heart swelled with pride, and she held her head high, walking beside Mrs. Thompson and her mother back through the terminal, where staff at the counter greeted her with warm smiles and nods of encouragement. As they checked in for their new flight, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that this was a turning point, a moment that was transforming her from the inside out. The staff led them to the plush, private first-class lounge, where Eleanor took in the cozy, luxurious seating and peaceful atmosphere, a world apart from the bustling airport outside. While they waited to board, a staff member approached them with a tray of refreshments. "Can I offer you something to drink, Miss Eleanor?" he asked with a friendly smile. Eleanor looked up at her mom, who nodded approvingly. She felt a little thrill at the respect in his voice, a stark contrast from how she'd been treated only a day before. She ordered a sparkling water, holding the cool glass with both hands. Savoring the moment, her mother reached over, squeezing her hand, both of them sharing a silent understanding of how much this experience meant. When it was finally time to board, a flight attendant escorted them onto the plane and into the exclusive first-class cabin, where Eleanor found herself in a luxurious leather seat, complete with a cozy blanket, a personal TV, and a beautifully arranged travel kit. She sank into the seat, feeling like a queen for a day, overwhelmed by the contrast to her initial experience. Just as she was settling in, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Today, we're honored to have a special guest with us. Eleanor, thank you for showing incredible courage, grace, and strength. We're delighted to have you on board, and we hope this journey is filled with the joy and excitement that you deserve." A soft round of applause spread through the cabin as passengers turned toward Eleanor with smiles and nods. Eleanor felt her cheeks flush. But it was a happy blush. She wasn't invisible anymore, she was valued and recognized. She smiled back, feeling a warmth that seemed to fill her from head to toe. As the plane ascended into the clouds, Eleanor leaned back in her seat, watching the world below grow smaller and smaller. The view from her window felt like a symbol of everything she had been through, the pain, the humiliation, and finally, the redemption. Mrs. Thompson soon made her way down the aisle to sit beside Eleanor for a moment. "How are you feeling?" she asked, her voice filled with genuine care. "Honestly," Eleanor said, glancing out the window and then back at Mrs. Thompson, "I feel happy, like, really happy. I didn't expect any of this." Mrs. Thompson smiled, reaching out to pat Eleanor's hand. "You deserve every bit of it, Eleanor. Your bravery helped us see where we need to improve. And because of you, changes are already in motion. We're implementing new training to ensure that every passenger is treated with respect." Eleanor's heart soared at the thought. "Really? All because of me?" "All because of you," Mrs. Thompson confirmed. "You reminded us that it's the people who make this airline special. And it's our responsibility to treat everyone with kindness and respect. You helped us see that." As they chatted, the flight attendants came by, offering Eleanor a delicious meal, presented with a small card that read, "With our deepest apologies and respect." She took a bite, savoring each flavor as if it were part of a celebration. For the first time in a long while, she felt truly valued. Midway through the flight, Eleanor noticed passengers nearby smiling at her, some even giving her small, encouraging waves. She realized that Mrs. Thompson's support and the kindness of those around her were like anchors, helping her stand strong in the face of everything she'd endured. When the plane finally began its descent, Eleanor looked out at the city lights below, glowing like stars against the dark sky. She felt a sense of closure, as if she were leaving behind a painful chapter but carrying forward all the lessons it had taught her. As they touched down, Mrs. Thompson leaned over to Eleanor one last time. "Remember, Eleanor, your voice matters. You have a strength inside you that will carry you far. And I hope this experience has shown you just how powerful you are." Eleanor nodded, her eyes glistening with gratitude. "Thank you, Mrs. Thompson. I'll never forget this." With her mother beside her, Eleanor walked off the plane with her head held high, her heart full. She wasn't just leaving the airport, she was stepping into a future where she knew her worth. And no one could ever take that away from her. As Eleanor and her mother exited the plane, she felt as though she had stepped into a new world. The weight of her experience had transformed her in ways she was still discovering. People around her walked with purpose, hurrying toward their next destinations. But Eleanor moved differently now, steadily, calmly, as if each step was a statement of her worth and dignity. Mrs. Thompson walked beside them, a proud smile lighting up her face. "Before you go, Eleanor," she said, stopping just outside the bustling terminal, "there's something I want to share with you." She held out an envelope with the airline's logo on it, sealed with an official stamp. Inside this envelope is a letter from the airline, expressing our apologies and pledging to address issues like the one you faced. "We're implementing changes because of you. Eleanor took the envelope, feeling its weight in her hand. She looked up at Mrs. Thompson, her heart swelling with pride. Because of me? Mrs. Thompson nodded. Yes. Because of you. I wanted you to have a copy of this letter so that every time you look at it, you'll remember the difference you made. We're rolling out new training for all our employees to ensure that every passenger is treated with respect and dignity. We're also establishing a feedback system that allows people to report experiences like yours, anonymously if they prefer. Eleanor's eyes shone with surprise and gratitude. She hadn't realized her voice could have such a lasting impact. She carefully opened the envelope, her fingers trembling slightly as she unfolded the letter. It was beautifully written, filled with heartfelt apologies and a clear commitment to improvement. The airline promised to prioritize respect and equality, to make changes so that every passenger, no matter their age or appearance, would feel valued and safe. You're a pioneer, Eleanor, Mrs. Thompson said, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. You've inspired us to reflect on our practices and make meaningful changes. You didn't just stand up for yourself, you stood up for everyone who might have been treated unfairly in the future. Eleanor felt tears pricking her eyes, not from sadness or humiliation, but from a profound sense of gratitude and accomplishment. She glanced up at her mom, who was watching her with pride. Thank you, Mrs. Thompson, Eleanor said, her voice barely above a whisper. For everything. Mrs. Thompson pulled her in for a gentle hug. Thank you for being so brave. I hope you'll carry this experience with you as a reminder of your strength. And remember, you'll always have allies standing with you. As they made their way toward the airport exit, Eleanor's heart was bursting with emotions she hadn't anticipated: pride, resilience, and a newfound belief in herself. She glanced at the people around her, wondering how many of them had ever faced similar situations. And she felt a wave of determination. She wanted to be a voice for those who felt invisible, for those who were afraid to speak up. Just then, she heard someone call her name. She turned to see a woman with a teenage daughter approaching her, smiling warmly. Excuse me, are you Eleanor? The woman asked, glancing between her and her mom. I was on your flight, and I saw what happened. I just wanted to say, thank you. What you did, standing up for yourself like that, was incredibly brave. You've inspired both of us. The teenage girl nodded, her eyes wide with admiration. I hope I can be as brave as you one day, she said, her voice shy but filled with sincerity. Eleanor felt her cheeks warm, a mixture of shyness and pride swelling within her. Thank you, she said, smiling back at them. I didn't think anyone noticed. Oh, we noticed, the woman replied, her expression kind and understanding. And so did a lot of other people. You're a reminder to all of us to keep standing up for ourselves and others. Don't ever forget the difference you made. Eleanor nodded, feeling a renewed sense of purpose and confidence. She wasn't just someone who had been mistreated, she was someone who had the strength to overcome, to make her voice heard, and to inspire others to do the same. As she and her mom continued toward the exit, Eleanor found herself filled with a deep sense of gratitude. This experience, painful as it had been, had shown her that she had strength she hadn't known was there. She had turned a moment of shame into one of empowerment. And because of her, real change was happening. When they finally stepped outside, the fresh air hit her face, and she closed her eyes for a moment. Taking in the feeling, she opened her eyes, looking at her mom, who had been her rock through it all. Mom, I'm ready to go, she said, her voice steady and filled with conviction. Her mom smiled, wrapping an arm around her. Then let's go home, Eleanor. I'm so proud of the young woman you've become. With one last look back at the airport, Eleanor felt a surge of hope for the future. She knew that she'd carry this experience with her forever. Not as a painful memory, but as a symbol of her courage and the impact one voice could make. As they walked away, Eleanor's head was held high, her steps sure and steady, moving forward with a heart full of strength, purpose, and resilience. The next day, Eleanor woke up with a new sense of clarity. The sting of what had happened still lingered, but it no longer felt like a burden. Instead, it felt like a lesson, a reminder of her strength, her dignity, and the power of her voice. At breakfast, Eleanor shared with her mom the words she had rehearsed silently to herself so many times. I want to tell my story. I want others to know they don't have to feel small. That they can stand up for themselves too. Her mom's eyes lit up with pride. That's a beautiful idea, Eleanor. Sharing your story could inspire others who might feel alone or afraid to speak out. After breakfast, Eleanor wrote her thoughts down, capturing each moment of her experience, from the excitement of boarding the plane to the pain of Amelia's treatment. And finally, the triumph of standing up for herself. She wrote about the support she'd received, the kindness of strangers, and the way Mrs. Thompson had turned the situation into a powerful lesson. It wasn't just a story of hurt, it was a story of resilience and growth. A journey that had changed her forever. With her mom's help, Eleanor posted her story online, where it quickly spread. People from all walks of life commented, sharing their own stories of overcoming similar challenges, and thanking her for her bravery. Messages poured in, words of encouragement and admiration from strangers who had been inspired by her journey. A few days later, Eleanor received an email from Mrs. Thompson. It was an invitation to an upcoming meeting at the airline's headquarters, where she would speak about her experience and meet with the team developing the new training programs. Eleanor was surprised, but the idea excited her. She'd never spoken to a large group before, but this felt important, a chance to share her story directly and make a difference. On the day of the meeting, Eleanor stood before a room of airline executives, managers, and staff members, each one watching her with respectful attentiveness. Taking a deep breath, she began, "Thank you all for letting me be here." Eleanor started, her voice steady, if a bit shaky at first. "I never thought that something so painful could lead to something so powerful. When I was asked to leave the plane, I felt invisible, as if I didn't matter. But because of the kindness and support I received from my mom, from Mrs. Thompson, and even from other passengers, I realized that I wasn't invisible. I was important, and I had a voice." As she spoke, Eleanor saw nods of understanding and encouragement. She shared how difficult it had been to feel alone and humiliated, how powerful it had been to find allies, and how much it had meant to stand up for herself and others. When people see someone in pain, it's easy to look away or think it's not our place to help. But because of the people who stood by me, I was able to find my courage. And I hope that through this new training, your airline will help everyone feel safe, respected, and valued, no matter who they are. By the time Eleanor finished, the room was filled with quiet applause. Mrs. Thompson approached her, a tear glistening in her eye, and shook her hand. "Thank you, Eleanor," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "You've made a lasting impact. And this airline is a better place because of you." Eleanor left that day with a heart full of pride, feeling stronger and more self-assured than ever before. She knew that the changes being made would reach far beyond her experience, helping countless others in the future. Over the next few weeks, Eleanor's story continued to inspire others. Local newspapers picked it up, calling her the girl who stood tall. She was invited to speak at a community event about resilience and courage, where she shared her experience with others, young and old, who had faced similar situations. At the event, a young girl approached her with wide eyes and a hopeful smile. "I'm going to start middle school next year, and sometimes I get scared about standing up for myself. But I want to be brave, like you." Eleanor knelt down, smiling at the girl. "Bravery isn't always easy, but it's something we all have inside us. Just remember, no matter what happens, your voice matters. Don't be afraid to use it." The girl beamed, and Eleanor felt a deep warmth in her heart, knowing that her experience had helped someone else feel a little less afraid. In the months that followed, Eleanor carried this newfound strength with her. She faced challenges with a steady confidence, knowing that she was never truly alone and that her voice had power. Her story had become part of her, a reminder that even in the face of injustice, she could stand tall and make a difference. And as she looked toward the future, Eleanor knew she would face it with courage and grace, stepping forward with an unwavering belief in herself and the knowledge that she had the power to change the world, one story at a time.